Good morning and welcome to the forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation about the current vaccine rollout and the related ethical questions it raises. We are happy to have back with us for this forum a panel of medical experts, including Dr. Jamie Ferrara, Dr. Jim Marion, and Dr. Clay Williams. Dr. Ferrara and Dr. Marion both practice at Mount Sinai School of Medicine here in Manhattan, where Dr. Ferrara is professor of pediatric hematology oncology, and Dr. Marion is a professor of gastroenterology. Dr. Williams is founder and CEO of Medaptive Health, which is a health tech startup that develops technology for use in medical clinical trials. We are also happy to have with us as our moderator today, Dr. Catherine Belford-Budd, who is a member of our vestry and an active participant in many areas of parish life. Before retiring several years ago, she practiced obstetrics and gynecology at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. A reminder that our panelists will have a chance to address your questions at the end of today's session. We encourage you to send them in at any time using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or by emailing me at pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. The sooner you send your question in, the more likely our panelists will have a chance to respond to it. And if you indicate which of the panelists you would like me to direct your question to, that would be helpful. And now, Catherine, I'll hand it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Peter. We are truly fortunate to have each of you with us today to share your expertise with us, so thank you. For most of 2020, we, along with the rest of the world, were eagerly awaiting the development of a safe and effective vaccine against COVID-19. In the US, as of December, we have had 2 vaccines that received emergency use authorization from the FDA for this purpose. The first released was Pfizer and the second from Moderna. Today, we have a bit of an ambitious goal, but we'd like to share with you how these vaccines work and what we can expect from them. We'll also touch on what the coming months may look like and what we as individuals can do beyond getting vaccinated ourselves to help end the pandemic. And as Peter said, we'll then turn to questions from all of you. Both of the COVID vaccines we have available use a new technology with messenger RNA or mRNA. Jamie, how do these vaccines actually interact with our immune system to provide protection?
Great question. So to understand how the vaccines work, you need to remember a little bit about how viruses infect cells. So viruses have a protein coating, and inside are the blueprints for making all of the rest of the virus. And so there are DNA viruses and RNA viruses. So DNA we all know about. Messenger RNA is an intermediate between DNA and protein. And COVID is an RNA virus. So when COVID infects a cell, it attaches by the famous spike protein. But when it gets inside the cell and sheds that protein coat, immediately it takes over it's a hostile takeover of all of the machinery in the cell. The cell then alerts the immune system and says, I'm under attack here. And the immune response is both T cells and B cells. T cells that were so famous in AIDS, and B cells, they're like the Marines. That's like hand-to-hand combat. And then B cells are like the Navy, and they launch missiles which are antibodies. And a full immune response requires both T cells and B cells, and it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to mount that initial immune response. So normally a vaccine is a protein vaccine or an antigen vaccine, and you inject the protein and you ask the immune system to respond to it. But these vaccines, both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, are different because they are mRNA vaccines. They actually mimic more of the immune response than a regular protein vaccine. It's the first time it's ever been used. It was a gamble. We didn't know whether it was going to work, but they have worked. Both of these vaccines have worked spectacularly well, in part because they mimic more of the immune response. And let me just say right now, since it's going to come up later, you get these are 2-shot vaccines. You probably have some protection after the first shot, but the immune response takes between 2 and 4 weeks to develop what we call memory cells. And if you get a second booster vaccine, you expand those memory cells, both the T cells and the B cells, by about 10-fold, we think, sometimes even more. So getting the 2 shots gives us extra protection. And the way we measure that protection is kind of one of the final end products of the immune response, which are these antibodies, which can neutralize the viruses and eliminate them.
Thank you, Jamie. Vaccines typically take many years of development, but these became available less than a year after the virus first appeared, which was really remarkable and exceeded everyone's expectations. Clay, give us some of the backstory of the decade or so of research that was in place that enabled this vaccine to be developed so quickly using this new mRNA technology.
Sure, thanks, Catherine. It's actually a really fascinating story because the public, we all kind of know about the sprint in 2020, but mRNA technology really got its start in 1990 with some early experiments on using RNA and seeing if it could promote an immune response in animals. And the NIH was a major funder of a lot of this research, and they viewed mRNA as a platform for new vaccine development. So you can think of a platform sort of like the internet. The internet's this infrastructure that we have, and you have whole businesses or whole systems that grow on top of it, like Facebook or Google or business systems. So the goal with mRNA was to have a platform in which we could respond quickly to viral threats and also address threats that weren't so easy to address. So the research on this platform has been going on for a couple decades. It's an exciting platform because it lets us do things, and as Jamie said, this was our first time really trying it in the field. Do things quickly, and it also the belief is that it can be used to create cancer vaccines as well. So it's a flexible platform. A couple of things about it that are important is it is relatively easy to make the mRNA. It's a reaction that occurs easily with good manufacturing practices. And it doesn't require use of infectious organisms in culture. So these vaccines can actually be even safer than traditional vaccines where we're either attenuating an organism or culturing something. The downside, as many of you know, is it's hard to store and distribute because these vaccines have to be kept very cold. And that it requires right now, these require 2 shots. But it's a very exciting platform, and it's a picture of the investments our government makes in order to innovate and keep us safer.
Thank you. It's very clear how basic science can take a very long time to see the payoffs, but it's very important as an investment for our country to do that. Clay, the mRNA, what happens to that after it does its job in the body?
mRNA is rather rapidly degraded in the cytoplasm of the cell. It is, and one of the things that was hard in a lot of the research was actually how to get it into the cell, because it's also degraded rapidly in extracellular settings where it's outside the cell. And that's because RNA floating around is a signal, as Jamie said, that there's something not quite right. There's possibly a hostile invader somewhere. So they use a lot of technologies to get it into the cell. It is transcribed for a while to make the spike protein, a copy of that the immune system recognizes. It's a harmless version. So you get the immune response but then it is degraded. So it goes away basically.
So it does its job and it disappears.
Exactly.
Jim, share with us a little bit about how effective these vaccines really are against COVID-19. And furthermore, how do we actually define effectiveness in this setting?
Great question. The way you define effectiveness has to include several different bars or benchmarks. Both of these, in the number you hear in the press, is they're 95% effective. And that number actually is quite telling, but it doesn't quite tell the whole story. So with these, what probably held up the final results on this was the fact that in this country, the number of COVID cases really dropped over the summer. You actually needed to have COVID circulating to see how well the vaccine was protecting the participants in the study. There were patients who got placebo and patients who got the actual vaccine. The 95% effectiveness number that you hear quoted is that patients actually got COVID, but had no repercussions or symptoms. They were completely asymptomatic. Moderna tried to go a step further to see if they could determine whether or not they were then infectious, and didn't quite achieve statistical significance in that regard, but I'm sure that data will be forthcoming. So 95% of the treated group had nothing. The other 5%, it's important to note, had extremely mild symptoms. So, again, nobody's going to say anything's 100% effective in medicine, but it brings the temperature and the threat of COVID down, way down, even for that 5% group. So hospitalization is highly unlikely. Their symptoms were relatively mild. They had a runny nose, they lost sense of taste, they felt lousy for a few days. But serious illness from it actually was not even seen in that 5% group. Whereas in the placebo group, it followed the same pattern that we've noticed, where the older you are, the heavier you are, the more comorbidities, there are hospitalization rates, morbidity and mortality rates in the placebo group that were observed, just as we're noticing and now with our over 400,000 deaths and among 25 million cases.
It's truly remarkable, and we should all be very grateful to everyone who was involved in the development of these. So Jim, we've heard that people are commonly experiencing some side effects with the vaccine. Can you share with us what, for those of us who haven't received the vaccine yet, what we might expect? Yeah,
so I think it's important to keep in mind that, and Jamie, Farah, I love when you talk about immunology because it makes the fireworks in my mind go off. You really just bring it right up. And I loved immunology in med school, but you really brought it right back. Your immune system is your defense against the environment. And it, in fact, gets suspicious. You hear often the sort of militarization terms, natural killer cells. And so your immune system is something that both protects but can cut two ways, right? We all know about conditions that are autoimmune, where your immune system is attacking. If you have severe allergies, something harmless like pollen can produce an immune response that makes you miserable. It can make you really quite sick, your immune system. So it can cut two ways. When you get a vaccination, what you're doing is you're enlisting the immune system in a way that you hope will be harmless. And in this case, the side effects that we're seeing so far for these vaccines are really relatively harmless. In enlisting that immune response, some people, depending on their immune status, may have one type of reaction. The most common reaction that we're seeing after both the first and second injection is usually mild fatigue and maybe a headache. Some patients after the second are even mounting a fever, which again is your body's immune reaction to the manufacture of this spike protein that the vaccine is provoking. So at the hospital, my patients are getting it. All of my colleagues now have been vaccinated. There's one other side effect, though, that nobody's mentioning. And it's true for every one of my colleagues who is still on call for, COVID duty. It's an unmistakable sense of hope for the future. I mean, it really was stunning. The mood was elevated immensely at the hospital getting this. But back to the actual side effects that people can encounter, generally quite mild, and for the most part, easily handled with some Tylenol and some hydration, particularly after the second one. The allergic reactions that you're hearing about are exceedingly rare. However, if somebody has a history of anaphylactic reactions, or in many of these patients were already carrying EpiPens around to protect themselves against allergic reactions anyway, then you need to let your doctor know that. You also need to perhaps think about having your injection given at a hospital as opposed to a clinic where they could handle it. That being said, those who do have these reactions respond promptly to antihistamine, or if it's a more severe reaction, corticosteroids, and they go home. They leave the hospital that day. So, and again, exceedingly, exceedingly rare. I've had a lot of experience over the years dealing with many types of vaccines, both live virus and standard vaccines, with my patients, and I would rank this among the most benign that I've encountered.
That's great news. So let's move on to supply then and rollout. Clay, Dr. Fauci has said that he absolutely believes that President Biden's plan of 100 million shots in 100 days is indeed feasible. But in many areas, including here in New York City, we see that our supplies are not adequate right now. What will be needed to be put in place for us locally and nationwide to get to that goal of 100 million shots in 100 days?
It's a great question, Catherine. And I believe Dr. Fauci's right. I think it's an aggressive goal, but it's achievable with the right plan. And so if you look at the early days of giving the shots, it was really not a supply constrained, but a distribution constrained problem. And we've actually flipped that now. So they've opened the aperture a bit to allow more people access to the vaccine. So they're seeing now the demand picked up, and some people are frustrated that the supply doesn't meet the demand. And so they're one of the things the Biden administration is really looking at is a federally coordinated distribution system that takes into account how, as supply flows in, do we get this distributed to the places where it's most needed, where demand is there, where we can get people inoculated. The second thing that Fauci makes, which is really important, is it looks like we're going to have 2 more vaccines come onto the market. He believes it's a matter of weeks, not months. The Oxford AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine are both nearing the end of their study period. And so, and then Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna are both ramping up production. And one of the nice things is, as I said earlier, these mRNA vaccines, it's a pretty straightforward process to produce the vaccine. It's a matter of capacity to run those reactions. So I believe we're going to see this push from manufacturing all the way to administering the vaccine to people really speed up over the coming weeks. And with these 2 additional vaccines coming into the market, probably, toward the end of that 100 days, but we'll get a even more upswell at that point. So I think as everybody said, there's reason for great optimism here.
There certainly is. Jamie, we know that several mutations have appeared in different parts of the world. What implications does that have for us in terms of illness and in terms of vaccines?
Right. Well, so a virus's natural biology is to mutate. The more successful mutations will become more widespread. That's remember, we're seeing if a virus generation is 20 hours instead of 20 years, there are 90,000 generations of a virus within 1 year. So we're seeing mutations now. Most of the mutations that have been identified so far are in this spike protein. The immune system recognizes the spike protein in a very sophisticated way. It's like those facial recognition things that you see in, sci-fi movies with the 29 points or whatever. And most of these mutations so far are like changes in facial hair. It doesn't change the facial structure of the virus, so the immune system can still see it. But there is, and that's why they seem to be more infectious. In other words, they get into the cells more easily, but they're not more deadly or more morbid. Now, there are other possibilities of mutations. We haven't seen them, but I think this is why the officials are now sounding the note of we should vaccinate people. We should walk, not run, to get our vaccinations so that we don't trip over each other, but not delay them unnecessarily. So most of the mutations will not affect the efficacy of the vaccines.
Terrific. Clay, you've used the term vaccine activism, which I love. What does that mean that I should be doing beyond just getting vaccinated myself, as Jamie has pointed out, to help end this pandemic? And why do my individual, one person at a time actions make a difference?
So Jamie actually kind of lobbed the first step to me, which is the walk but not run statement. It's important for all of us to be ready, but not to try to be rushing out of the theater or skip a place in line in spite of the anxiety. And when it comes to activism, I break it down into sort of really three things. One is once again, a personal practice, being informed about what's happening. And that is really key. Number two, a big piece of the federal plan to vaccinate 100 million people is predicated on $400 billion in funding to improve the infrastructure of what's happening. It's important that that bill get passed, that those funds become available, and that we can move at a faster pace. So if people can reach out and advocate for a system that allows us to do this more quickly, that's important. And then finally, if you look at the great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and might, and your neighbor as yourself, really advocating and looking at those most at need of vaccine and asking some hard questions as people of faith about, are we doing the right thing? And if we're not, how can I advocate that the communities that have been hardest hit, where people may have the fewest resources and be in the most danger, how can I advocate that they are treated equitably?
Wonderful.
And if I could just add on to that for a second, not only is that in some ways the charitable thing to do, but if we want to let's say in New York City, you can make an argument that by vaccinating the people where the virus is most prevalent, you actually will save the greatest number of lives, including those in areas where the virus is less prevalent, because you've reduced the ability of the virus to find human hosts. So there is we can do well by doing good here in a very direct way.
Great. Jim, help us take a look at the time beyond the next 100 days. Assuming that we reach this goal of 100 million shots in the next 100 days, what does the long-term picture look like? When will we how do we actually achieve the end of this pandemic?
So the way this is going to feel, I think, for most of us is it's almost like a fog lifting and it's suddenly clear around you, and it won't be apparent until the last minute almost. And the reason for that is the rollout as it is, even with 100 million shots, is probably not enough to bring this under control. Now we're blasting, I think we're at 20 million shots given in this country as of this morning. So I agree that the 100 million goal is achievable. I'm actually hopeful that we're going to go well beyond that. And I think Dr. Fauci's statement and optimistic comments about the Johnson & Johnson product and the AstraZeneca product emergency use approval is fueling a lot of that. So how is it going to look, though, by summer, right? Before everybody was ready to say, well, spring is going to be when it's over. If you look at the one country that's probably vaccinated the greatest proportion of its population, and that would be Israel at this point, their overall infection rate plummeted by 60% within the last week. So that's telling, and that's how it's going to look. If you look at, for example, when polio vaccine came out, as the number of vaccinations went up, suddenly one summer, it was no longer a threat. The cases had simply evaporated. And I think that's what we're going to see going forward. Our intensive care unit beds and hospital beds will see those censuses go down. We'll see the number of positive cases go down. But it's not going to be in a single day. It's going to be over several weeks as we build up the proportion of our population who have already been vaccinated. And I think going forward, we're going to have awkward moments. When do we stop wearing masks? When can we, as a parish, gather again safely and with confidence? Will people have passports that they've been vaccinated? What will the data about infectivity say about how we can interact going forward? All of those are going to become apparent as the next few months go by. But I'm quite optimistic if you compare the way other viral pandemics have played out once the vaccine had been taken by enough of the population to subdue its spread.
It's so reassuring how overall optimistic these questions have been answered, and I'm sure it will be a welcome source of information for everyone else. We just have a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes before we're going to move to Peter to answer questions. Is there anything that any of you would like to add before we start taking questions? I'll open it up to all of you.
Well, I would just like to say that, most vaccines against viruses are in the range of maybe 50 to 60% effective. So when we first saw the data from these 2 trials, the terms were like jaw dropping. We couldn't believe that it was 95% effective, and they themselves did not expect that it would be 95%. We obviously hoped for that, but they were ready to have them be 50% or 60%. So this is really wonderful news. It's not just like another flu shot season where we get them out of sort of citizenship. This is really a remarkable result, and people should feel confident about getting the vaccine.
Yeah, I would echo that, Jamie. Jamie, Clay, and I, we've all been doing clinical trials. I've been doing clinical trials since the mid-90s. You never see a 95% result.
Right.
You never see it. And I have to say, this is probably going to change the way that we assess the efficacy of vaccines going forward. I think we are going to be moving past, a lot of the ways that we're vaccinating our children, or think of shingles. We saw that in real life. Shingles was originally a lousy vaccine. Then they came up with an advance, and it was a new product called Shingrix. And suddenly people started to say, wait a second, why don't we start applying these new platforms to some of the old models? So I think stay tuned for that. This is an advance that we're going to be able to take advantage of in many different areas of medicine.
All right, Peter, we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you so much to all of you. There's a lot of gratitude that has already been expressed for the expertise and wisdom that you're sharing with us this morning. There are a few questions already. I encourage those of you who are watching who have questions to send them in. Again, you can use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me at pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. The first question I'll send to you, Jim. This question comes from someone who's understandably worried about the vaccine rollout and the lack of supply, particularly in the city. And the questioner wonders what happens if after receiving their first dose, the second doses have run out, and even more specifically, what happens if they've received the first dose from one company and the only doses left are from another company? Can you get your second dose from the other vaccine?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer both of them separately. So the first one about your second dose, and I can tell you that at Mount Sinai, and I know in New York State, when you go in to get your first vaccine, they are required to sequester your second dose in reserve and put your second appointment in, and that dose is put aside, right? So that's the way it's being done at Mount Sinai, and that's the way New York State has mandated that the vaccines be distributed. So concern about whether or not they will run out for your second dose, once you've had the first one, they've sequestered the second dose. That being said, in the United Kingdom, they have been sort of mixing and matching, meaning you could get the Moderna first and then get the Pfizer second, or vice versa. That was approved in the United Kingdom. That has not yet been approved here in this country. And concerns have to do with the fact that the clinical trials themselves, as great as the results were, did not mix and match. So it's outside of the evidence. However, given the severity of the pandemic, both here and in the United Kingdom, I think the UK has been really hit quite hard by this, and still is, that they opted for that strategy. We may see that. I've seen that on the list of possibilities to try to stretch it out. Also, giving the second dose later, assuming that the maybe 50 to 70% efficacy from one injection, which I want to remind the audience is better than our flu shot that is given every year, that perhaps that should be enough. And then maybe try to give a booster dose, later than that to try to stretch the supply, trying to extract another dose out of every vial. So yes, everybody's trying to squeeze it as much as they can. But I think once you have your first appointment, you should rest assured your second dose has been sequestered.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I'll send the next question to you, Jamie. This is a person who has significant comorbidities, but is just under the age threshold for being for getting the vaccine right now. Any recommendations for this person on navigating the vaccine process, and any recommendations in general on getting an appointment?
It's important to remember that the most effective tools that we have now are still very effective, as social distancing and mask wearing and being very cautious about other people that you're in line with or come into contact with. Those are very effective. And they don't stop being effective because we have a vaccine. Now, there is a lot of talk about, where could I get the vaccine? And I've heard some people say, well, you could go to Brooklyn, or, some people have flown to Florida because you don't have to be a resident of Florida. I would suggest that's not the best approach. That's likely to tangle up the lines. And honestly, the best advice that I think I can give you is, Jim talked before about hope as a side effect, but we need to have a little patience here. It may be an extra couple weeks before you can get it, but that is, or maybe even a month. But even in this household, because I'm in the hospital, I've gotten a vaccine. Flora has not been able to get one yet, but that has not changed our sort of behavior. So I think that some prayer and patience will go a long way here.
Thanks. The next question is for Clay, and the questioner wonders if the vaccines that have not yet been approved, if they are also mRNA based, and how vaccines that are not mRNA based might approach the virus.
Yeah, so the two vaccines that are sort of next in line for an emergency use authorization are not mRNA vaccines. They're more traditional platforms. And so they, and they have some advantages themselves. So the Johnson & Johnson shot, for instance, is a one-shot vaccine. So this whole need for a second shot is not there. And both vaccines are built on modern platforms, largely either around protein-based vaccines. And so these are a little bit different in the way that they work, but they also have the advantage that, distributing and storing them is easier. They don't have to be stored at really cold frozen temperatures. So these bring sort of a hopeful diversity to the range of vaccines that are available to help roll this out and get this going. It'll be really interesting to see what the interim analyses show about efficacy, as both Jamie and Jim have said. 95% is a very high threshold. So if you hear these come in below that, do not despair. If these come in at some number that is in the range of things that have worked well for us, they are still a really valuable tool. And you should not hesitate. I wouldn't hesitate to get one of these vaccines. Let's say it came in at 75 or 80%, and somebody said, you're going to get the Johnson & Johnson. I would not say, no, I have to wait for the Moderna. It's really a valuable tool in the arsenal. So the fact that we have this diversity is actually going to be a good thing.
Peter, may I add one thing to what Clay said, and I agree completely. The questioner had said that they had some comorbidities, and I know many of my patients with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are very concerned about these vaccines, especially about the vaccines that are coming up, the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca product. The Johnson & Johnson product uses a harmless adenovirus vector to get the same process going within the cell. So a lot of patients are concerned about taking live virus vaccines. For example, if they're on immunosuppressant medicine, they've been told not to do that. You can't get yellow fever vaccine when you're on these medications. And the simple answer is it's not the same thing. The adenovirus is completely harmless. So when you hear that there's an adenovirus vector, this is not a live virus vaccine in the classical sense. It's something completely new. So I just wanted to add that, Clay.
Thanks. And actually, the next question is for you, Jim. A question about what we may know about long-term side effects. And there's a particular concern about fertility in young women.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how this concern is sort of being fueled, right? So long-term issues from this new platform, theoretically, I'm just not sure where this concern is being derived from, to be honest. So we know the side effects of COVID. Getting infected with the wild virus can produce really significant long-term morbidities for patients. So the long-term complications of COVID, you've heard about these long haul cases. I think, and again, I'm not talking about the death rate. I'm not talking about the hospitalization rate. I'm talking about how lungs can be damaged more severely than if somebody had smoked their entire life, and perhaps taking years off of somebody's life over time. So again, the morbidity long-term of the virus itself vastly outweighs any theoretical concerns about the vaccine. So I don't know, Jamie, you and Clay may have other comments on this, but when I hear long-term side effects of the vaccine, again, it has been a short run in terms of the study, but thus far, the main issues with the vaccine are short-term, transient, to be expected sort of immune activation responses that we're seeing in these patients. So the long term, yes, we're going to follow everybody. The post-marketing research on these is going to be intense, but thus far, no signals have come up now with over 20 million people having been vaccinated.
I completely agree with Jim, and I wish the conspiracy theory vaccinology types would just be quiet, because it's a conspiracy theory, and we shouldn't pay attention to them.
Thanks, Jamie. I encourage those of you who still have questions to send them in now. Live chat function on YouTube, comments function on Facebook, or email pthompson@stbarts.org. Jamie, we've had several questions about the ability of those who have been vaccinated to spread COVID to others, and a related question of, if I've been vaccinated, do I need to wear my mask? And if so, why?
Very good question. Thank you, whoever asked that. Please wear your mask, even if you've been vaccinated. The data are not there yet about whether it completely stops our ability to transmit the virus. It is very likely to be less. It will be less. The question is how much less. But you still remember, one in 20 people can still get COVID. Even now, it will be less, but you can still get COVID even if you've had the vaccine. So please wear your masks probably until the summer is when we're likely to be much closer to this herd immunity goal. And that's really what we should be doing. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of that question, Peter. What was it?
Is to what extent can those who have been vaccinated spread COVID to others? Do we know?
Right. So we don't exactly know. It's going to be less. Remember, those antibodies neutralize the virus very quickly, but not instantaneously. So if you get it, there could be hours or maybe a day where you could still transmit the virus. And let's help still protect each other by wearing our masks when in public.
And I would add to that, Jamie, I completely agree. I want to remind everybody from our last COVID forum, it is a dose-related toxicity, this virus. So if we're going to be putting out a lower dose after we've been vaccinated, it could be that it just suddenly we're dealing with a virus that is just not getting out in the concentrations or producing the exposure. The second piece is that, at least in New York, I guarantee you, if you decide I'm Iron Man or Iron Woman and I'm not going to wear my vaccine right now, the people around you are going to make comments. So at the very least, for social reasons and to keep the social lubrication here in New York going, wear your mask for the time being.
Right.
Clay, what percentage of the population needs to be vaccinated before we reach herd immunity? Do we have any sense of that number?
So we have ideas about that number, but we don't know the exact number. And with a vaccine that's 95% effective, so the more effective your vaccine is, the easier it is to reach herd immunity. And so, if you look at, so Dr. Fauci sort of talked in the earliest days about 60 to 70%, and he began to push that number up a little bit as he talked more. And he actually, on one of the morning Sunday shows, talked about why he did that, is he wanted the population to understand that herd immunity is a range, and he thinks it's in the range that he was talking about. And as he talked about the higher end, he's really encouraging people to get vaccinated. If we move toward, 70, I don't know. I'm going to guess it's in the range 70 to 85%. That may be off, but that's kind of, if you look at what Fauci has talked about, and I really trust his dialogue on this, that's the range he's been speaking about. And so that kind of tells you where we need to get. With 95% effectiveness, though, that could go down as well. It's feasible.
And I just want to add that these percentages are a global, not a local or even national number. So this effort really has to be extended throughout the world in order for the pandemic to be effectively ended.
And Catherine, I think that's really important, and it's something that often gets lost in the discussions about the U.S. is what we do in the developing world to make sure there's equitable distribution, and this is handled. It's a global pandemic.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in a few last questions here. The first for you, Jim, how long do we think protection from these vaccines lasts? Do we know?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the first time this question came up was when people were getting the infection and they recovered from it. And then a paper came out and said, you're protected for 6 months. So all of from getting seriously ill from COVID again. And I remember thinking, this is remarkable because it hasn't even been here for a year yet. Right? How could they know that? So I want to remind everybody, even though it feels like we've had COVID with us forever, it is in fact a novel, new virus in the human population. That being said, the concentrations, at least in the study group of antibodies, showed a really quite robust antibody response that was durable over the length of the study. So the projections that I'm hearing are 2 to 3 years. However, stay tuned, we're still learning. But the robustness of the response was really quite remarkable, so I'm quite optimistic. And echoing what Clay had said before, think of measles for a moment. Measles, the vaccine we use for measles is not quite this effective. And we know that the magic number for measles is about 70% participation in vaccine. Once you get below that, then you start having measles outbreaks. Remember that before COVID when measles was everybody's biggest concern, right? Right? So, I think we need to keep in mind that vaccines work. We need to get as full participation as we can. And again, my optimism remains intact.
Jamie, there have been some reports or rumors that some of these new mutations might be resistant to the vaccine. Is there any foundation to those?
Well, the one scientific paper that I read showed that actually all of the mutants, and this was about a week ago, but that all of the mutants, both in primate models as well as in humans, that all of the mutations that had been studied were actually covered by the current vaccines. Now, there is a report, I think it's the Brazilian mutation that there may be less effectiveness, but I haven't actually seen the scientific data around that. But I was very encouraged by it because it was something like 7 or 8 mutations, again, all in the spike proteins. So for where we are, right, and that included the UK variant, and that included the Los Angeles variant. So I think that we are, again, because I think of the way these vaccines work in eliciting the immune response, that it mimics it so with such fidelity and such strength, that we're actually covering, the vaccines will be highly protective. Maybe not completely, but I haven't seen any scientific data that I think are yet convincing that we have a mutation that would escape the vaccines.
And I would add to what Jamie said, I think the nimbleness that these vaccines offer to us are illustrated by the fact that we were able to get the genome of the original COVID-19 from China, and within 13 weeks have vaccines in a vial into somebody's arm in a clinical trial, right? So that's a 13-week stretch between identifying the genome and having a vaccine. So these platforms, I think, offer great promise for nimbleness and responsiveness should, heaven forbid, we have some variant that somehow does an end run around these vaccines. I agree with Jamie. I think it's highly unlikely, but I think we're in a very different era now of being able to manipulate these platforms.
And I would just like to add, I completely agree with Jim, but one of the things that we haven't talked about, Clay touched on it a little bit, but the public health infrastructure in this country is appallingly bad, given how good the science is and how good we are at other aspects of taking care of ourselves medically. So one of the things that I hope that we can do as a society is really start to build this back up, because this will not be the last pandemic that we face, almost certainly. Whether it's a mutation from this, I think that's actually a little lower risk, but there are other pathogens and viruses that are likely to come our way in the next several years, and we simply must rebuild the public health infrastructure to be able to get from vaccine to vaccination, but also just general protection, and that's something that we really probably don't have time to talk about today, but that should be on people's minds going forward.
Jamie, I'll just echo very quickly that's top of mind for also this activism. This is the third coronavirus we've seen in the 21st century, and they come about every 9 years, it looks like right now. That's three don't make a pattern, but we've got to get on top of this.
And we do unfortunately need to end now, as I know the organ prelude is starting very, very soon. A very final question, very, very quickly. I promise I didn't plant this to the four of you. Will all of you take the vaccine, and will you advise your family to do the same?
I got my 2 already, and I can't wait for my wife to get it.
I will absolutely get it. I'm not eligible yet, and I can't wait until I am.
I get my second dose in 2 weeks.
Yep.
Thank you all so much. We are so fortunate as a community to have your expertise and your guidance in these issues. Thank you all for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.
Bye-bye.